Thanks. I'll tell you about it later. Ask me about it later. All right, good morning, class. Whew, y'all sound sleepier than me. And that's saying something. I have my emotional support beverage. I hope you have whatever you need to do class today. Welcome to our Bible study. Last week we began the book of Jonah, and we did a chapter, minus one verse, but I left that on purpose because that verse feels like it leads into the next chapter. So we did a chapter in one day, which for me is pretty good. Full disclosure, this next chapter, the whole thing is a prayer, basically. And it's a poem, and it's what I prepared for this Sunday. I have a habit of running long. You guys may get a refund in minutes today. If we finish a little early, I hope y'all won't be mad. But I'm not going to try and stretch into chapter 3 today. So let's start off as we usually do with a little bit of review and some scene setting. So the book of Jonah is a book following one of God's prophets. And like a book like Daniel, for example, or 1st and 2nd Samuel kind of do the same thing, follows the life of a prophet much more so than it chronicles all of the prophecies that he gave, right? So if you think about Ezekiel or Isaiah or Malachi, those books that tend to get grouped into the Nevi'im, the prophets section of the Old Testament, most of what you're getting is just their prophecies. Jonah is unlike those books because he doesn't prophesy much in this book. I suggested to you that he may have offered a prophecy last week. It's not really told to us that the Lord spoke to him, but he kind of spoke for the Lord, and it worked, so maybe he'll have one more prophecy before the book is over. And just as a preview for you, in the original Hebrew, it is 5 words long. So Jonah was a prophet, and I told you last week that there are kind of two categories of Old Testament prophets. There are the occupational prophets, right? The ones for whom being a prophet is their full-time gig. It's what they do, you know? And, you know, a lot of the prophets that spring to mind probably fall into that category. People like Elijah and Elisha. That's all they did, you know? Mentioned Samuel earlier, Isaiah. And then there's other guys. You get like an Amos. He's just a fig farmer. And one day, God taps him on the shoulders and says, hey, it's time for you to go give this message to my people. Who remembers, which category does Jonah fall into? Is he the full-time professional prophet, or is he the tapped on the shoulder one day kind of prophet? Well, that's how he acts. He acts like he's a tapped on the shoulder one day kind of prophet, but actually, based on some other references in the Bible, namely 2 Kings, if I remember. Yeah, 2 Kings. It looks like, no, Jonah actually was a full-time professional prophet. Well, that's the thing. But that's spoilers, man. Spoilers for a, several thousand-year-old story. Yeah, so the question is he a major or a minor prophet? There is no such thing as a major or a minor prophet, but we use the terms major and minor prophet because what we're referring to with those terms is the length of the book by their name. So a major prophet would be like Isaiah. He's like or Jeremiah, they come straight to mind. Not the bullfrog and not the ice cream place, You're welcome. I probably owed you one. What makes it a major prophet is it's long enough that it has its own scroll. Minor prophets are shorter books, and they would typically be on a scroll shared by other minor prophets. So the terms major and minor are not about significance at all, simply the length of your book. So, if we look at how evangelical churches in America go, or maybe just churches throughout the history of the world, I would be a minor preacher. Right? My sermons go 15-ish, 20-ish minutes maybe, right? As compared to some churches, you sit down, buckle in for 45 to an hour to an hour and a half sermon, right? So, hopefully you don't feel like I'm a minor preacher, but using the same terminology, that's how that would go. I am a full adult. I don't have as much gray as you, but I'm catching up. All right. So Jonah is a prophet, and I encouraged you last week, and I'm going to, as we continue through this study, to encourage you to just, for the sake of fully, if nothing else, fully enjoying the book. I want to encourage you to read this as if you've never read it before. You might know how the story's going to go, right? And if you haven't read this as an adult or in the last 20 years, you may be surprised by some of the things that we read in here. But for now, I just want to encourage you to just pretend that you've never read this book before. So the story starts off, God says to Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh and speak out against them. And Nineveh was an overland journey northeast. Nineveh would have been politically and militarily a threat to Israel. It was the capital city of the evil superpower of their day. And so God's motivations aren't given, and Jonah's motivations aren't given. Facts are said about what happened. So God says to Jonah, go speak against them. And Jonah hops in a boat. He doesn't need to he doesn't need to get in a boat to go to Nineveh. He hops in a boat, and instead of traveling northeast, he travels west, as hard and fast as he can go west. It said in chapter 1, verse 3, Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Friends, where is the Lord present? May I ask? Everywhere, okay? But in the ancient, particularly pagan world, gods tend to be thought of as local, right? If I asked you to name some Greek gods, you would have no problem doing that. You know a few Greek gods. If I asked you to name some German gods or Nordic gods, maybe you could do that. Probably wouldn't be the same list, right? If I said, name a Chinese god, none of you are going to go, Zeus, right? Unless you know things I don't know. So we kind of get a sense of this, right? And then also thinking about, because I use Greek gods because many of us in school had to do things with the Iliad, the Odyssey, and all that, so we're familiar with the Greek pantheon, and it still kind of floats around in our popular culture. So if I said, well, okay, Zeus, what is Zeus the god of? What would you say? Thunder, yeah, sure. And he's the king of the gods, but yeah, thunder, right? If you wanted to bless the love between a husband and wife, the temple of Zeus isn't probably where you'd go, right? You go to the temple of Aphrodite, right? Or Venus, if it's Roman gods. right? So the gods had their own little domains, and they had their own specialties, right? So Jonah, the professional prophet, hops in a boat to flee to Tarshish. Not really. He's not really going to anywhere. He's going away from. And what's he going away from? You might think Nineveh, because he's going the opposite direction of Nineveh. And that's kind of true, but according to the Bible, he's not really going away from Nineveh. He's going away from his calling, but specifically, he's going away from God. So Jonah's on the boat, on the sea, and a freak storm comes up, right? Well, no, it's not a freak storm. What it is actually is the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. So the boat's getting rocked, and it's bad. And the sailors, who are, it should be noted, and I think we're so used to like mass transit. If you want to travel somewhere, you buy a bus ticket or a train ticket or an airplane ticket, and most of those things are made to carry people from place to place, right? Mostly in the ancient world, that's not really a thing. If you're trying to get somewhere, you're going to travel by foot, or maybe you'll have some animals with you that you'll drive. But if you're making a journey across the sea, people aren't worth it. Right? It's expensive. So you have to be doing commerce. So the ship is loaded up with cargo. The cargo is going to pay for the voyage. And sure, Jonah bought his ticket too, so he's contributing toward it. But it's not like this is a private jet that he chartered. He probably doesn't have that kind of salary, right? So he paid to ride along with all the other things the boat was doing. So winds blow, and they're threatening to tear the ship apart and flip the ship over. And these men, these professional sailors whose job it is to sail this sea, are scared to death. Now, you got to think they've seen some storms in their time, but they are scared to death. And they start throwing the cargo into the sea, which means financially, they're hosed, right? If they incur debt to buy that cargo on the hope that they'd sell it on the other side, they're in real bad shape. But if they didn't, well, they're still going to be out not only the cost of the voyage, and possibly the cost of the ship, but also all that cargo they purchased. So they're in bad shape. But, they want to live. And so they're all praying. They're all praying to their gods. Whatever God they've got, they're praying to them. Nothing's working. And so they go down into the belly of the ship, and there's Jonah sleeping while everybody else is doing everything they can. So far, Jonah has contributed nothing. So they wake him up, and they said to him, well, who are you? Where do you come from? And what's your job? And he said, I'm Jonah, and I won't tell you my job. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, so I don't think that these men would recognize him as Jonah the prophet, if that's what you mean by disguise. They might have been able to recognize him as Hebrew. I don't know how much visual distinction he would have had. And clearly, there's not a language barrier because they're talking. So he knows whatever language they speak, and they know whatever language he's speaking to them in. So, do they know that he's a Hebrew? Maybe. Do they know who Hebrews are? Maybe, maybe not, But when he tells them, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the God of heaven. Well, that doesn't sound good. Where's the storm coming from? Right? I worship the God of heaven, who made the seas and the earth. Remind me again, where was Jonah going? Away. Where do you go to flee from the God of heaven who made the earth and the seas? So he knows the right answer. Right? He knows it, but he doesn't know it in the deep down parts of him that actually makes the decisions, right? I know you've heard many a pastor, many a Christian talk about the difference between like knowing and believing, right? Or that long trek of whatever that is, 18 inches or whatever from your brain to your heart. But Jonah's a perfect example of this because he actually knows the right answers, but it doesn't touch his decision making. So they said, well, what do we need to do to make your God happy? And he says, you got to throw me into the sea and then you'll be safe. Did God say that? I don't know, because it doesn't say that God said that. We'll find out in a little bit that when they do it, it works. So maybe God said that. Or maybe God is just showing mercy to these people on the ship anyways. But keep that in mind. The story does not say that God said to throw him in. It does say that they tried to row back, and that didn't do any good. So, anyways, they really don't want to throw him in, so they do try to row back, but when that doesn't work, they pray to Jonah's God, saying, please find us innocent of this man's life. Don't punish us for killing one of yours, right? And they pick him up and they throw him into the ocean, and what happens immediately? What's that? The water's calm. And interestingly, that's not the end of the story for the sailors. We actually get a little more. So the sailors, we learn, make it to dry land. So God shows his mercy to them. And they, in turn, offer sacrifices and make vows to Jonah's God. I don't know if I did a good job of illustrating this last week, so I want to spend a moment on this. I think that this is a powerful testimony about how God works. Because an outside observer, without all of the information we have, would go, what a cruel and vengeful God to potentially kill these men for things that they didn't do or know, right? How would a loving God let a disaster like that happen? But actually we see, well, at least in this case, God not only spared their lives, but it seems that he did so that they would know him. So these men come to, are we going to see them in heaven? Maybe, I don't know. I'm going to give you a strong maybe on that. But I can at least say they come to saving faith in the sense that by faith in the word of the prophet, they obeyed God and were spared. Right? Is that not a literal definition of saving faith? So they acted in faith, God spared their lives. And in return, they offer worship to him and make vows to him. And I think that one's interesting in particular, right? Because you can offer a sacrifice and go away, and you're done. But if you make a vow, that's not about today. That's about the future. So they're entering into some sort of an ongoing relationship with Jonah's God. Well, the question is, why didn't Jonah just jump? And I would suggest to you that it doesn't seem at least this far in the story, that Jonah is a man of courage. Or even, like, does he ever do anything that he could have somebody else do for him? Like, I haven't seen it yet in the story. Yeah. You wouldn't jump. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so would you jump? I think if the boat is actually breaking up, a lot of people are going to jump because it's going to look like that's safer than staying on the boat. But presumably we're early enough in this event that the boat's still intact. So I don't know. But yeah, why didn't he just jump? Maybe God did say that they need to throw him in. But I think the picture we're painted of Jonah is a man that probably doesn't have enough self-control and resolve to. He knew he was the problem. And it doesn't seem as if he had it in him to be the solution. We'll get there. Hold on to that thought until late in chapter 4. We'll get there. All right, so that's where we left off. They were thrown into the ocean. The sailors come to some sort of a faith. They offer their sacrifices and vows. Let's get on to chapter 1, verse 17 and chapter 2. Chapter 1, verse 17. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Okay. Now, when I was a little boy, I pictured this was a whale. And then when I was in, let's say, junior high, I learned that whales aren't fish. And so if somebody said that Jonah got swallowed by a whale, I'd say, no. The Bible says it's a fish. And whales aren't fish. Well, here's the thing. That sort of thinking is a bad hermeneutical move. It is a bad biblical interpretation move because it presupposes all of the definitions and understandings of our modern world and puts them onto the writer of the Bible. I want to be careful before I make this move, though, because people can abuse this idea to make room for the Bible to not be strictly true. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the way that things are named. That's what we're talking about. I'll give you another example. It says in the Bible that there was a miraculous moment where the sun stood still in the sky. And there were, and bizarrely, there are now people who will claim that you have to believe the earth is flat and that the sun literally is smaller than the earth so that it can be in the sky of the earth, or else you don't have a biblical worldview. That's bananas, okay? That's bananas. That's not what that verse means in any way. What that verse means is that relative to where the people stood when they looked up in the sky and saw the sun there, the sun did not move relative to them. Did God do a thing to the orbit of the earth? Probably. That's probably how he accomplished it. I don't actually care how he accomplished it, but it does not mean that the earth is flat and that the sun is smaller than the earth, right? So similarly, right, we have this distinction that whales are mammals. They are, aquatic mammals, which means they are not fish. They belong to a different category. Well, that's all well and good for us. Bats aren't birds, but if you're in ancient Hebrew, they are. Could they tell the difference between a bat and a canary? Yes, they could. They could see the beaks and the weird feet and the handy looking. Yes, they get it. But like the word they used was, this is a flying critter that's bigger than a bug. This is a swimmy thing with fins. It's a fish. They didn't care about the manner in which they reproduce or feed their young. It's just not a distinction they were making with their language. I've gone a long way afield to make this point that it might have been a whale. It might not have been a whale. I don't know. Maybe it was the Kraken. I don't know, man. Like, doesn't really matter. But it does matter that we understand you can't do those kind of moves, right? People do this with the word dunamis in the Greek. I'll point this one out to you as well. You might have heard it. Many well-intentioned preachers have done this thing, and it's just wrong. When the Bible talks about, receiving, let's say Jesus telling the disciples that they'll receive power from on high, right? And the word is dunamis. And they'll say that's the same root from which we get the word dynamite. So when you read dunamis, it's this explosive power. No, that's not how it works. Dynamite was named after the Greek word for power and authority. There was nothing explosive about like Jesus. Can it be? Sure, but that's not, you're putting your modern thing on top of it. Okay. I have soapboxed enough that y'all are looking at me like I'm insane. Let's move on. So was it a whale? Maybe. Does it matter? No. Chapter 2. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, before I read his prayer, this is the first time in the book that Jonah has talked to God. Of all the things that have happened so far, Jonah has not prayed yet, even when the captain of the ship asked him to. This is the first time that Jonah prays to God. And I find that remarkable because I think he had things to say to God this whole time. Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh. Jonah doesn't ask God about it. He doesn't plead with him for a different assignment. He doesn't ask God to send somebody else. He doesn't anything. He certainly doesn't say, yes, sir. He's on the ship threatening to break apart. He knows what's up. He doesn't pray. He doesn't pray, God, spare these people, right? Or anything. So he's thrown into the ocean, and finally he prays. Let's read it. I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. All right, so let's nail a couple things real quick. First off, I know I've talked to you guys about Sheol before. We talked about it in our Revelation class, but I'll just give you another little primer on it. It is not sufficient to think about Sheol as being hell. It's not really the way the word works. It is best to understand Sheol simply, and I would not encourage you to put anything extra on top of this. Sheol is the place where the dead go. So if you think of the grave, sure, you could think of the grave. I don't want to conflate this with the underworld of pagan mythologies or anything like that. It's not the best way to think about it. Could it share space with the idea of hell? It could. But it doesn't necessarily mean that. It doesn't necessarily mean like the lake of fire that you picture from Revelation. It simply means the place of the dead. Okay? So he says he's in Sheol. And from Sheol, from the belly of the place of the dead, he cried out. So in this poetic description of his situation, Jonah is already dead and buried. Now, is that an exaggeration? Yeah, okay. But that's the way this is framed. And what that means for us, the reader, is that if God heard the prayer lifted up from the grave, then the grave is not beyond the reach of God either. And maybe we should stack that onto the list of the God of heaven who made the earth and the seas. You could add to that list the God who even answers the prayers and opens the door of death. Verse 3, for you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Who cast Jonah into the seas? The sailors, but he says God did it. And, if he received that word from God, what must happen is they need to throw you in. Then that makes sense. And so maybe we can put that piece of the puzzle in place. But if that's true, then Jonah is admitting here that these pagans who did not know him were his servants, and that they were executing the will of God. And that's quite an indictment if you think about it, because he is literally the chosen messenger of God, called to execute the will of God and refusing to do it. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Verse 4, then I said, I am driven from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. That thing where, it's a cliche. I can't say it's ever happened exactly like this to me, but when you're in a very dangerous, imminent situation and they say your life flashes before your eyes. I mean, I've never had that experience of my life flashing before my eyes, but there is this phenomenon of time dilation, right? Where everything seems to slow down. What's happening is your mind is processing things super fast in that moment, right? You get a burst of fast processing. There's a lot going on in this moment when Jonah sinks to the bottom of the ocean. He has this whole thing, but maybe actually, right? As he thinks he's going to die, maybe he really does have all this experience. Maybe, he's being a little bit waxing poetic after the fact, but, So his first stated thought, I guess, the first thing he says when he realizes this is happening is that he is being driven from God's sight. Now, remind me again, where was Jonah running? Away from God. His hope was to be out of God's sight. And now that he feels as though he's getting it, is it what he had hoped? It's actually the last thing that he wants. So he says, I've been driven from your sight. And now actually that's a bad thing, isn't it? But he has a hope. Yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. This means that he has faith from the belly of Sheol, from the midst of the grave, that he will be resurrected in some fashion, and that he'll get to go home. But when he's thinking of home in this moment, he isn't thinking of his house. He's thinking of, God's house. Why was he so sure that God would rescue him? He isn't there yet, though. In this part of the story, as he's retelling what happened, right now he's in the process of drowning and hasn't seen the fish yet. That hasn't happened yet. So why is he so sure? Yeah. See, he knows something about God's character. He knows that God delights in saving those who repent. He knows that God likes to save people. And that he kind of will, wherever that makes sense. He's going to save people, right? Hold on to that thought until we get to the end of chapter 4. I love that Jonah is such a messy person who knows so many things about God, and yet he doesn't access them all the time. And a lot of times, maybe on autopilot, he doesn't think about them. Or maybe, spoilers, or maybe he does think about them in all the wrong ways. We'll get there. All right. Yes. Yes, he's praying this prayer in the belly of the whale. But what he's saying right now is the prayer that he was praying before he was saved. And this distinction will matter here in a moment. But you'll see it in the next verse. Let me just read the next verse and you'll see. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds wrapped around my head at the roots of the mountains. Right? So if he's telling about when this happened, he's having a panic as he's about to drown. We're gonna hit bottom on this here in a moment. I went down, verse 6, I went down to the land whose bars close upon me forever. Yet you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. Now again, he's praying this prayer from within the fish. But he's talking about being brought up. As a child, when I read this, when I was told this story in Sunday school, I thought the fish was God's punishment for Jonah running away. But the fish isn't the punishment. The fish is the method of salvation. Jonah's drowning until the fish comes to swallow him up. And once he's swallowed up by the fish, then he offers up a prayer of thanksgiving. It's from the belly of the fish that death has been overthrown. It's from the belly of the fish that victory is already being proclaimed. Does this make sense to you? It's not the way I understood the story. I thought he was in jail for 3 days, right? I thought the fish was the bad part. And I'm not going to tell you being in the fish was pleasant. Aside from, look, let's just set aside everything that he's probably feeling in the digestive tract of a giant fish. The smell alone is probably pretty unpleasant, right? But he's rejoicing in the belly of the fish because he's already experiencing God's salvation. All right, so I went down to the land whose bars close upon me forever. What is the land whose bars close upon me forever? What is that? The place that everyone goes and normally we would think of nobody ever comes back from. Where is that place? Death, right? He's talking about being dead. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. And this is, I think, nothing short of both resurrection and redemption language, right? He is talking about being pulled out of the mouth of death. Ironically, perhaps into the mouth of a fish, but he's being brought out of death. But I also think about, being brought up from the pit. That picture can evoke a few things. You could think about like when an animal falls into a pit and they are going to die, but then you go pull them out, right? Jesus uses that illustration when talking about the Sabbath. But I also think about like Joseph when his brothers attacked him. And eventually they put him in a pit as a holding cell until they sold him off into slavery, right? In this case, or you can think about, Daniel being lowered into the lion's den, right? But God has pulled him out of the pit. He did so using the fish. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you and to your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. I find this interesting. He says, I remembered the Lord. But as I read the story, he's been thinking about God the whole time, just not in good terms. Like, he's running because of God. He's in the sea because of God. He said he understands that the storm is because of God. God is on his mind a lot. So what does he mean? I remembered the Lord. What's that? Yeah, but I, when I think about remembering, I usually would assume, well, I had forgotten, and then I stopped forgetting, right? Then I remembered. But God's been on his mind this whole time. So what does he mean he remembered the Lord? Yeah, perhaps this is about he remembered what the Lord is like. Or perhaps he remembered that the Lord is for him. Not just that he is the Lord, but that he is Jonah's God in all of the good ways. Verse 9. Verse 8, and then we'll do verse 9. For those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. A couple things come to mind as I read those verses. I get a hint that Jonah maybe feels superior to those sailors, right? Well, they all prayed and nothing happened. And I worship the God who does things. Okay? And as for me, as opposed to all those pagans, well, I will offer sacrifices and make vows. But little does Jonah know what? The sailors have already done all this, only they didn't have to be swallowed up by the sea and then a fish to get there. And I do wonder, maybe, if Jonah has a newfound appreciation for sacrifice since he is one. He was a sacrifice offered for the salvation of that ship. He was, I guess it's an overstatement to say that he died so that they would live, but he was given over to the grave so that they would live. And then God in his mercy brought Jonah up from the grave. That's the end of Jonah's prayer. So Jonah prays a really nice prayer. I guess he had 3 days to refine it, right? Edit and re-edit. So after he says amen, figuratively, verse 10, and we will stop here. The Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. Was Jonah in timeout? Was Jonah in thinking time until he got his heart and mind right? And then God thought, well, okay, he gets it now. Maybe. What's up? Well, certainly the fish is bringing Jonah back to the start, right? Certainly Jonah, the fish is undoing the wrong that Jonah had done, right? Which is Jonah was running by sea. The fish brings him back. It doesn't tell us where he was spat up on dry land, you know? So I can't make a solid case to this. Maybe he was spat up, just right next door to where he got washed out. But I picture, and this is just my own embellishment, so don't take this as the gospel truth, but I picture that he wound up, right where he started, maybe in Joppa, where he hopped on the boat. Maybe God spits him up right at Joppa. Wouldn't that be beautiful? Could you imagine being the guy who sold him the ticket 3 days earlier or 5 days or a week earlier? Like, don't I? What happened? I don't know. But here is the thing that I want to highlight for you because I think this is interesting. And it's said here in a fashion that's different. When God sent the winds, it said that he hurled them upon the sea. But with the fish, it said God appointed a fish. He said to the fish, "You're my guy." And then when the time was right, God spoke to the fish, which, by the way, means that God at least speaks fish language, or fish understand God, or what, that's all fine. But when it comes to God working out his salvation for Jonah, he does it by speaking. Salvation for Jonah comes through the word of God, which I think is so cool. It could have said, like, the Spirit of the Lord fell upon the fish and it drove him to the way. But it's not how it says it. It says God spoke to the fish, which is so gentle. He spoke to the fish. And the fish obeyed. God spoke to the prophet, and the prophet disobeyed. God spoke to the fish, and the fish obeyed. And spits them up on dry land. And it would have been so easy and convenient for God, when Jonah ran away, for God to just go to the next prophet on the list and say, "Hey, Hezekiel, Kaiah, whatever, you're going to Nineveh now." I think we're going to find by the end of the book that going to Nineveh was a pretty sweet deal. Where we're at in the story right now, it doesn't look like that. Where we're at in the story right now, the prophet is supposed to go speak against it and then live with the consequences. If you're reading this book for the first time, you think Jonah's running away for fear of what Nineveh will do to him. And maybe he is. We'll just have to get there in the story to find out. But I do think it's interesting that God did not give this job to somebody else. Jonah got spat up on dry land, and he gets a do-over. We'll read about that next week. Perfect. 10 minutes till. So go ahead and fresh up your coffee, whatever you got to do. Do the shuffle, move from your Bible study seat